Right now, I want to bring in MS Now legal affairs reporter Fallon Gallagher from outside the Supreme Court. Jake Traylor is covering the White House. Henrietta Treyz is co-founder and director of economic policy at Vita Partners. Jeffrey Rosen is a law professor at George Washington University. And with me in studio, MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin. Fallon, just run through this for us. What does this ruling say?
Yeah, Laura, this is a massive blow to the president for his signature agenda item from a conservative-leaning court that has typically been very sympathetic to the president and his agenda. In this ruling, this Supreme Court has found that IEEPA, that law that the president used to enact 5 categories of his sweeping tariffs, is unconstitutional for tariffs. That is, that the Congress has not given the president this authority to use that law, IEEPA.
Daniel Cave is back, and what is happening right now goes far deeper than angry social media posts about unfair rulings. Trump is not simply venting frustration about judges who rule against him. He is not merely expressing the kind of disappointed criticism that any defendant might direct at an unfavorable decision. What is unfolding right now is something far more calculated, far more sustained, and far more dangerous to American democratic institutions than a frustrated tweet posted at 3 in the morning. He is running a deliberate, organized, methodically executed campaign to convince the American public that federal judges who rule against him are not simply wrong on the law. They are criminals. They are corrupt actors who have abused their positions. They are enemies of the people who deserve not just criticism, but punishment, consequences. Accountability directed at them personally for the audacity of applying the law equally regardless of who the defendant happens to be. And the truly chilling dimension of this campaign is how it is being executed. This is not about dramatic courthouse confrontations or loud public spectacles that burn bright and fade quickly. This is something more insidious, more patient, more strategically designed to do lasting damage to the institutions that stand between executive power and total unchecked authority. This is a long game. And it is being played with a deliberateness that should alarm every American who believes that an independent judiciary is not a political inconvenience, but the last line of defense between the rule of law and the rule of one man. Watch this explosive hearing unfold, and stay tuned for a full breakdown of everything that went down. Don't forget to subscribe and help us hit 100,000 subscribers. 2
invoked tariffs, and I want to read very briefly from Justice Roberts' majority opinion. He writes, IEEPA's grant of authority to, quote, regulate importation falls short. IEEPA contains no reference to tariffs or duties. The government points to no statute in which Congress used the word regulate to authorize taxation. And until now, no president has read IEEPA to confer such power. And I was inside court for oral arguments, and much of the discussion and debate surrounded on that word regulate and whether regulate meant tariff. Now, the justices here have found that it does not, that is a power that is reserved for Congress, and that the president does not have the authority to use this specific statute to impose his tariffs. But notably also in this decision, it's written by Justice Roberts. That's not entirely surprising because the Chief Justice, when he sides with the majority, will typically write the opinion for these consequential cases. But notably, 3 of the typically conservative-leaning justices are in the majority here. You see Roberts, you also see Justice Gorsuch and Justice Barrett, who are here siding against the president in this very significant case. Laura?
Legislation specifically designed to criminalize judicial independence. Public intimidation campaigns targeting individual judges by name, directing the fury of millions of followers at people whose only offense was applying the law without regard for who the defendant happened to be. And a systematic, sustained, carefully coordinated effort to delegitimize the only branch of government that possesses the constitutional authority to look a president in the eyes and say, no. Not Congress, which can be pressured, primary threatened, and politically maneuvered. Not the executive branch, which he controls directly. The judiciary. The one institution specifically designed by the founders to be insulated from exactly this kind of political pressure, precisely because they understood that someday a leader would come along who viewed independent courts not as a constitutional safeguard, but as a personal obstacle. The line between executive and judicial power is not written in flashing lights. It is not enforced by an army or a physical barrier. It is invisible, existing in the shared understanding that no branch of American government operates above the others, that no individual holds authority that the Constitution does not grant, and that the courts exist specifically to enforce those boundaries regardless of who sits behind the resolute desk. And Trump has decided that line no longer applies to him. That decision, made deliberately, executed systematically, and now being translated into actual legislative proposals and organized intimidation campaigns, represents a direct assault on the constitutional architecture that has protected American liberty for over 2 centuries.
Fallon, thank you for that. And we just have some news from the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, who said that President Trump will hold a press briefing on the Supreme Court's tariffs decision at 12:45 p.m. Eastern today. Jake, what are we hearing from the president so far from the White House?
Yeah, Laura, she dropped that literally at noon on the dot. She was teeing it up for your show, I guess. So we will hear from the president for the first time at 12:45, unless we get a Truth Social post first. This is sometimes how it goes, but it was a bit notable that when this decision came down, the president was actively in a meeting, a bipartisan meeting with governors at the White House. And a White House official that was in the room tells me that a note was brought in, given to the president. This is when the press had already been escorted out, so there were no cameras capturing this in the moment. The president read that the SCOTUS decision had been made, not in his favor. He then addressed the governors directly and said, quote, "It's disgraceful what the courts have done." That was according again to a White House official who was in the room for that moment. In terms of other things that are happening internally at the White House right now,
Let me pull back the curtain on this completely, because the timeline of events is absolutely critical. And the connective tissue linking those events together is precisely what most mainstream coverage is failing to identify, document, and present to the American public in a way that reveals the full picture. Because when you examine these developments in isolation, one angry speech here, one piece of legislation there, one social media attack on a named judge somewhere else, they can each be dismissed individually as the normal noise of a combative political figure venting frustration. But when you lay them out in sequence, when you trace the timeline carefully, when you connect the dots that the daily news cycle keeps treating as separate, unrelated stories, a pattern emerges that is impossible to explain as coincidence or spontaneous outrage. This is coordinated. This is deliberate. This is a strategy. The story accelerates during a period when the calendar turns and the chill of high-stakes political battles fills the air with the particular tension that comes when power feels genuinely threatened for the first time. The president, standing before a gathering of Republican lawmakers in a setting designed to project strength and command loyalty, begins making statements about the federal judiciary that go far beyond anything a president has publicly said about the courts in living memory. This is where the curtain starts to lift. And what is behind it is not reassuring.
Another White House official tells me that obviously at this point the West Wing is very aware. For a long time now, the president as well as other senior officials have been teeing up that they have some way to counteract a decision of this sort happening. Another White House official told me that they are unsurprised by this decision and that this is something they've planned for a long time. What we lack at the moment are actual substantive details of how they intend to counteract this SCOTUS ruling. The president, as early as last night, railed against the Supreme Court, saying he had been waiting time after time for a ruling to come down. Take a listen to that.
I've been waiting forever. And the language is clear that I have the right to do it as president. I have the right to put tariffs on for national security purposes, countries that have been ripping us off for years. You know what they were doing? Using tariffs. What a country. So sad.
Laura, as you can tell, the president pretty fired up right there in that moment. A couple of big questions, of course, right now are, one, what happens to all of the money that companies have already paid due to the current tariff ruling that exists before the ruling came down today? And then secondly, of course, as the White House keeps saying they have a plan, which we know they say a lot of times, they've been working on something to counteract. What are the specific details of that? Hopefully this press conference in just the hour will give us some new details.
He launched into a tirade that, had it been delivered by any previous occupant of the Oval Office, would have triggered a constitutional 5-alarm fire that burned across every front page in the country and dominated every news cycle for weeks. He looked directly at the members of his own party, his own allies, the lawmakers who had stood beside him through every previous controversy, and he demanded a new crime bill. Not a bill aimed at the fentanyl traffickers poisoning communities across America. Not a bill targeting the violent repeat offenders who make city streets feel genuinely dangerous for the families who live on them. Not a bill addressing any of the genuine public safety concerns that Republican lawmakers have campaigned on for decades. This bill had a very specific target, a very deliberate target, a target so unprecedented in the history of American executive politics that the room should have gone cold the moment the words left his mouth. The target was federal judges. The people who sit on the bench and apply the law without regard for who the defendant is or how much political power they wield. The people the Constitution specifically insulated from exactly this kind of political pressure, because the founders understood with absolute clarity that an independent judiciary is not a luxury of democratic governance. It is the foundation of it. And the President of the United States just stood before his own party and demanded legislation to criminalize the exercise of that independence.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions about that, too, that Jeffrey, I'm going to go to you in just a moment. But first, Lisa, I want to come to you here. What stuck out to you about this decision?
There are a bunch of things that stuck out to me. Let's start with the thing that struck both Fallon and I alike. Across 170 pages, Laura, there are 7 different opinions written by the 9 members of the court. That means that while 6 justices got to the result that IEEPA, the statute on which the president was relying, doesn't authorize him to impose the tariffs at issue, they got there in different ways. Think about it as like a choose your own adventure book. It all has the same ending, but what happens in the middle for some of these justices is quite different. The other thing that struck me about it is it's a victory not only for the plaintiffs who brought the case, but for Congress as a whole, even if some Republican members of Congress don't see it that way. If you read Justice Roberts's...
His words were not ambiguous. They were not carefully hedged with the kind of diplomatic language that politicians typically deploy when criticizing the judiciary. There was no softening, no qualification, no acknowledgement that judges are constitutional officers performing a function the founders specifically designed to be independent of presidential preference. He told the assembled members of Congress, his own party, the people who will be asked to vote on whatever legislation emerges from this demand, that these judges are criminals, that they need to be cracked down on, that the judicial branch exercising its constitutional authority to rule against the executive is not a feature of American democracy, but a threat to it. And critically, he was not invoking the constitutional remedy that actually exists for addressing judicial misconduct. The impeachment process, which is written directly into the Constitution precisely for situations involving judges who commit genuine high crimes and misdemeanors, was not what he was calling for. What he was calling for was something entirely different. Something the founders never contemplated and the Constitution never authorized. Something that crosses a line that no previous president, regardless of how frustrated they became with adverse rulings, ever approached.
Opinion for the court, you read Justice Gorsuch's concurrence, you see them basically say the power to regulate importation, which was the phrase at issue here, isn't one where we know exactly what it means, but here's what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean the power to tax. That is a power that is reserved constitutionally to Congress. When it wants to give it to the president, it knows how to do it and how to choose the right words in terms of how to do it. And in Justice Gorsuch's concurrence, he even has sort of a overture to the importance of the legislative process, that it is messy, that it is long, but that in the structure of our constitutional system, Congress's role is one that includes not only the power to tax, but the power to make laws, and that we as a country need to respect that. Even if it takes time, there is a value in that. So I see this court really vindicating Congress here, even at a time where Congress isn't doing much legislating on its own. Laura.
Right. We saw Congress push back here and there on specific tariffs that the president imposed, but the justices were saying essentially that if Congress wanted to expressly give this power to the president, they would have said so explicitly. Yes. And just so for the folks at home, when we say IEEPA, we're talking about the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which was passed in the 1970s. But Jeffrey, on what happens next, those questions that Jake laid out, what does happen now? Are these tariffs gone? Can the president impose other tariffs that he wants to? And what happens to the money?
He was not referencing the appellate ladder, the mundane but essential process of appealing an unfavorable ruling to a higher court. That process exists. It functions. It is the legitimate, constitutionally designed mechanism for correcting judicial errors when they occur. Every defendant in America has access to it. It is how the system is supposed to work. That is not what he was describing. He was talking about something categorically different. Something that has no precedent in American constitutional history. Something that would, if enacted, fundamentally and permanently alter the relationship between the executive branch and the independent judiciary that exists specifically to check its power. He was talking about criminalizing the act of ruling against him, making it a prosecutable offense, a crime subject to investigation, charges, and potential imprisonment for a federal judge to sign an order that contradicts the expressed will of Donald Trump. Transforming judicial independence from a constitutional protection into a criminal liability. Converting the act of applying the law equally and without regard for political consequences into conduct that could end a judge's career, freedom, and life. And the silence in that room when those words landed. It was a sound that will echo through history books. Most of the Republican lawmakers present did not stand up, did not object, did not remind the president standing before them that the Constitution they all swore an oath to protect specifically, deliberately, and urgently prevents exactly what he was just demanding they help him do. They sat, and they listened, and that silence was its own answer.
Well, that's the central question, and the answer isn't clear. For the tariffs that have already been paid, which is up to billions of dollars, individual importers have to sue one by one to get them back. And some have already filed lawsuits. Others will file them in the future, but that's going to be a messy and complicated process. The administration has said that it's going to try to reimpose tariffs under other authorities, other statutes, but they don't give the president as much flexibility as the emergency law does. So some of them may go forward and others may not. This is going to create tremendous uncertainty for investors, for consumers, and for international trade partners. Canada, for example, already says that most of its goods are not under tariffs, but it doesn't think that this decision will have a huge impact on the trade war with Canada. So although it's extraordinarily important and historic that the Supreme Court has asserted the separation of powers, has made clear that the president can't exercise authority that's granted to Congress, this will not by any means stop tariffs globally, nor will it definitively resolve how people can be reimbursed for tariffs that they've already paid.
So I guess we'll have to wait and see what other kinds of tariffs can stay in effect or that the administration may impose. But Henrietta, earlier this month, the Tax Foundation said Trump's tariffs cost the average household an extra $1,000 last year. And over the course of 2025, we saw items like coffee and tea go up almost 12%. One study found ground beef spiked 19%. So what does this mean? What does the decision mean for the average American when it comes to their pocketbooks?
The people whose institutional oath is to defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic, said absolutely nothing. They absorbed this direct, documented, openly stated assault on a co-equal branch of government as though it were just another rant about crowd sizes or media bias. As though a president demanding legislation to criminalize judicial independence was simply the background noise of a contentious political moment, rather than one of the most alarming things any American president has ever said out loud in front of witnesses. This is not hyperbole. This is not dramatic framing designed to generate clicks and outrage. This is a genuine, documented, conducted entirely in the open attempt to use the legislative power of the United States Congress as a blunt instrument to bludgeon the judiciary into submission. And because the news cycle is a ravenous beast that consumes itself every 24 hours, this staggering moment was largely swallowed by the next wave of controversies before it could fully penetrate the public consciousness and receive the sustained, serious attention it demands. The context surrounding this demand is what transforms it from a concerning outburst into a coherent and genuinely terrifying strategy. This demand for a judge punishment bill did not materialize in a vacuum. It arrived hot on the heels of a stinging, humiliating defeat at the highest court in the land. The Supreme Court, that marble institution where Trump had meticulously placed 3 of his own ideological allies, dropped a legal anvil on his signature economic policy. The sweeping global tariff scheme, the engine of his trade war ambitions, ruled invalid. The vote was 6-3, not a nail-biter, not a narrow procedural punt. A definitive, unequivocal declaration that the president had overstepped his constitutional authority. The majority opinion, crafted with the kind of precision that leaves no room for future creative reinterpretation, stated clearly that the president does not possess the unilateral power to remake the global economic order using a vague emergency statute from the 1970s. This was the system working exactly as the framers designed it. The executive branch acted. The judicial branch reviewed. The judicial branch said, "Stop. That is not how this works." For any president who accepted the fundamental premise of American governance, that would be the end of the road. You appeal, you lose, you pivot to a new legislative strategy. That is how it works. That is how it has always worked. But for a president who has spent his entire public life operating under the assumption that rules are merely suggestions to be bulldozed, this ruling was not a legal check. It was an act of war. His response was immediate and venomous. He did not hold a press conference expressing disappointment while vowing to respect the court's decision. He took to his digital platform and unloaded on his own appointees. The very justices whose confirmations he had celebrated as historic victories were suddenly reclassified as part of a weaponized deep state apparatus. He accused the court of issuing bad and wrongful rulings. He painted the institution, not as the neutral arbiter of the law, but as a political hit squad operating specifically to undermine his agenda. This is the crucial psychological and political pivot. By redefining the judiciary as a political enemy, he is creating the moral and rhetorical justification for treating them as one. If they are not impartial guardians of the Constitution but merely political actors in robes, then why should they be immune from political retaliation? Why shouldn't Congress pass laws to punish these political actors? It is a closed loop of logic that is perfectly coherent if, and only if, you first accept the premise that the president is the sole, legitimate arbiter of power in American government. Once you accept that premise, anyone who says no to the president is not exercising their constitutional duty. They are committing an act of sabotage. And saboteurs in any system are criminals. Now here is where the story shifts from the president's offensive to the judiciary's defensive countermeasures. And this is the part of the narrative that has flown almost entirely under the radar of mainstream coverage. The federal judiciary is a famously reticent institution. Its power rests on moral authority and the perception of impartiality. Federal judges generally do not hold press conferences. They do not issue fiery rebuttals to politicians. Their culture is one of monastic restraint, letting the weight of written opinions speak for themselves across generations. So when the Judicial Conference, the policy-making arm of the entire federal judiciary, issued formal written guidance stating that judges are now permitted to speak out in measured defense of the court against illegitimate criticism and attacks that undermine judicial independence, that is the institutional equivalent of a fire alarm being pulled in a library. It is the sound of an institution that has been pushed to its breaking point and has concluded that silence is no longer an adequate response to what it is facing. The guidance was universally interpreted by legal ethicists and court watchers as a direct green light for judges to push back against the specific targeted attacks emanating from the White House. Courts were telling their own members, the usual rules of silence no longer apply. You may defend the institution publicly, because the institution is under a public assault unlike anything we have witnessed in the modern era. And then, as if to punctuate that internal guidance with the force of a gavel, Chief Justice John Roberts stepped into the public square. The Chief Justice of the United States. A man who guards the institutional prestige of the Supreme Court with extraordinary and deliberate care, issued a stark, unambiguous, impossible-to-misinterpret warning. He said publicly and on the record that dangerous personal attacks on judges have got to stop. There was no nuance. There was no need to read between the lines. The target of the remark was as obvious as sunlight. The Chief Justice, the head of the judicial branch, was looking directly at the head of the executive branch and delivering a message that the American constitutional system has not required in living memory. The intimidation campaign is unacceptable. It is dangerous to the Republic, and it must stop. That this moment did not dominate the national conversation for a solid week tells you everything you need to know about the state of our information ecosystem. We are so inundated with cascading crises, so bombarded with manufactured outrages, that a direct constitutional warning from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to the sitting President of the United States barely registers as a sustained blip on the collective attention span. But this is not normal. This is a 5-alarm fire in the basement of the Capitol, and the fact that we can barely smell the smoke should terrify us. The judiciary's response, therefore, is not a petty political squabble. It is an existential defense. When the Judicial Conference tells judges they can speak out, but they are acknowledging that the traditional shield of silence is no longer sufficient protection against what they are facing. The attacks are not coming from fringe websites or late-night cable commentary. They are coming from the podium of the White House and the floor of Congress, with the full institutional weight of the executive branch behind them. When Chief Justice Roberts says the attacks have to stop, he is deploying the only tool at his disposal: the moral authority of his office. He cannot order federal marshals to arrest the president for contempt. He cannot defund the executive branch. He can only speak. And the fact that he felt compelled to speak, to break the tradition of judicial reserve in such a direct and confrontational manner, is the clearest signal we have that the judiciary believes it is in a genuine fight for its institutional survival. This is not a dispute over a legal doctrine. This is a dispute over whether there will be anyone left to interpret legal doctrines in the future. We must return to the chilling silence on the question of war powers, because it is the shadow that gives this story its terrifying depth. The same lawmakers who might privately cheer the Supreme Court for checking executive overreach on trade are conspicuously, almost deafeningly absent when it comes to checking executive overreach on war. The Constitution could not be clearer on this point. Congress declares war. The president commands the military. That line has been blurred for decades, but it has never been erased with the kind of explicit, civilization-threatening rhetoric we are witnessing now. The political cost of opposing a president on national security is perceived to be higher than the cost of opposing him on economic policy. It is easier to vote against a tariff on aluminum than to vote against a bombing campaign, even an unauthorized one. This disparity is the crack in the foundation of any meaningful institutional reawakening. The judiciary is standing up. The Senate stood up on trade. But will anyone stand up when the next confrontation is not about commerce, but about war? That question is not theoretical. It is the next chapter of this story, and it will be written in real time. This is the bottom line, and you need to carry it with you. A sitting president of the United States is actively engaged in a campaign to criminalize the federal judiciary. He is doing this out loud, in front of lawmakers, on social media, at political gatherings, without apology or concealment. He is demanding that Congress pass laws to punish judges for rulings he does not like. He has attacked his own Supreme Court appointees after they ruled against his expansive claims of executive power. And he is doing all of this while simultaneously making threats on the international stage that legal experts warn would constitute grave breaches of international law. The federal judiciary, an institution designed to be quiet and reserved, to speak only through its written opinions, has been forced out of that reserve and into the open. They have issued new ethics guidance empowering judges to defend themselves publicly. The Chief Justice of the United States has issued a stark, direct, historically significant warning that these attacks must cease. This is not a normal political fight between branches with different policy priorities. This is a war for the soul of the constitutional order. A fight over whether the document that has governed this nation for over 2 centuries still means what it says, or whether it has become, in the hands of a sufficiently determined executive, merely a suggestion. The courts are doing their job. They are removing the legal foundation from under the president's most aggressive power grabs. And he cannot stand it. He cannot stand being told no by people he cannot fire, cannot intimidate into silence, and cannot replace with loyalists. That is the source of his fury. And that fury is now aimed directly at the heart of the American rule of law. Stay tuned, because the next time we convene, we will be examining the precise mechanics of what happens when a president decides that a court order is just a piece of paper. That is the line we are approaching. And you need to know what tools remain to stop the country from crossing it. You're watching Daniel Cave. Subscribe now and help us hit 100K. Drop your thoughts in the comments below.